Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Vortex, where lies and falsehoods are trapped and exposed. I'm Michael Vorse. Following up on last week's Vortex, where he talked about misinformation routinely being pumped out by Catholic social media types, it's time to dig a little deeper. One of the routine pieces of information being bandied about is that Jorge Bergoglio is not really the Pope. And let's hasten to say this right up front so everyone is clear: the denial or heavy suggestion that Francis is not Pope is actually part of a larger agenda which is not specifically stated by many of these folks. They're keeping this part from you. Many notable Catholic internet types want to drive people out of the church and into the arms of the schismatic SSPX. Behind the scenes, meaning they won't come right out and tell you, they are in league with the schism. They will deny it's a schism, or they will say, well, it's complicated, or they'll say, it's not clear, or there's not really a way to know. First, those are lies by them. Behind the scenes, they have cast their lot with these schismatics. They just won't come out and tell you because maintaining the illusion of being neutral provides them cover to keep advancing this agenda. Make no mistake, they are all down with the schism, 100%, and they need to have the you know what to come out and say it. Pope John Paul II called the SSPX schismatic. That's from him right there. It's a schismatic act, that consecration of the bishops. He did that all the way back in 1988, which is when they broke away from the church. Pope Benedict said their problems are doctrinal. Look at that, doctrinal. And because of that, they have no canonical status in the church, and they do not legitimately exercise any ministry in the church. Pope Francis, in the accompanying letter to his motu proprio, Traditionis Custodes, specifically called, quote, the healing of the schism with the movement of Monsignor Lefebvre. Schism. How many more times do popes have to say this? That's 3 popes in a row. So if you have a problem with the schismatic SSPX being called schismatic, take it up with the popes, not church militant. And further, you will never hear these Catholic e-celebs or media outfits ever repeat these declarations of schism by the popes. That would completely derail their, it's not very clear strategy. It's extremely clear. 3 popes in a row. Pretty darn clear. Unless you're being deliberately deceptive with your audience, particularly if there's a financial advantage in being so. The strategy of either flat out denying Francis as Pope or strongly suggesting it, hinting around at it, or what have you, is the front for destabilizing people's faith in the church and raising a doubt. Once that seed of doubt is planted, then chatter can begin about the legitimacy of alternatives, of where the true church actually is. The true church is where she has always been, under the jurisdiction and authority of the Pope, even if he's a bad Pope. History identifies roughly dozens of popes who have been horrible, bad, rotten to the core popes. Some of that history is captured in a 1950 book called Pageant of the Popes by John Farrow. It details the rotten pontificates. It's right here, see? Pageant of the Popes. Details these pontificates of the most dastardly men ever to occupy the throne of Peter. Some will argue the book needs updating. Okay, fair enough. That discussion can certainly be had. But no matter how bad Francis is at poping, it does not make him not the Pope, nor does it allow Catholics to leave the church and join a schism, and most importantly, nor does it allow Catholic internet personalities profiting from the confusion that they help foster to use their websites and platforms to weaken people's faith. St. Paul explicitly admonishes people to be extremely careful and patient in dealing with those whose faith is new or weak. The constant hammering on Pope Francis and pointing to the questionable comments and interviews and confusion and all of that would have a place with these outfits if it was solely being said to reinforce people's faith. But that's not the case anymore. It hasn't been for a while now. It's being used to weaken people's faith so that they will consider joining or running to a schism. A schism, remember, declared by 3 successive popes, which they just completely gloss over. It's also the reason when the news broke almost 3 years ago about the massive leadership run cover-up of abuse in the SSPX, sex abuse. None of these outfits or personalities breathed a word about it, and some actually went on record denying it. They covered it up. Multiple proofs later, and now they just ignore it. As to weakening people's faith, how much more weakening could you engage in than to plant sufficient doubt in a person's mind about the legitimacy of Pope Francis than to have a priest walk away from his vows and end his priesthood because of it? Yet that is exactly what has happened at least once. One Catholic podcaster, and who it is not that important because so many of them are all beating this same drum. A Catholic podcaster planted sufficient doubt in one priest's mind that he up and left. Here is the comment directed straight at that internet personality, spoken it would appear in support of this podcaster's efforts. The comment to him says, quote, "A young priest I know who consumes your content religiously for a few years now, at the end of his year of absence, has decided to call it quits. He credits you opening his eyes to Pope Francis. Pray for him." Wow, really accomplishing a good work of the church there. In another instance, a podcaster actually published an internet poll asking people if they think Bergoglio is actually the Pope. Less than half the respondents said yes. A majority were either not sure he was Pope or they just said no. This is exactly what these Catholic internet websites and personalities want you to conclude, because that way it makes the schismatic SSPX look more attractive, more legitimate, or so the plan goes anyway. It is likely the case, although I don't want to pass judgment, but it is likely the case that this all began innocently enough with these folks being disturbed at the constant confusion that is the hallmark of this papacy. Check that box absolutely. On all those scores, they are spot on. Rome is in a woeful shape right now. The church is, some way, looks like a dumpster fire with no relief in sight. Heck, long before these guys started standing in front of their webcams saying these things, it was church militant right here alone pointing to all of it. But unlike them, we never made a hard turn to suggest that going into schism was an acceptable remedy. They do, directly or indirectly. And they are being intellectually dishonest with their viewers and their supporters to not just come right out and say, "We think the SSPX is the place to be." Just come out and say it, guys. Be honest instead of squirrely. They collect loads of money from the pro-SSPX crowd, but they also have the support of many people who do not realize their duplicity. So for them, appearing to sit on the fence and allowing supporters to read between the lines, it's a good business model. But that's just it. Behind the scenes, they don't sit on the fence at all. They are totally down with the schism, be their motive ideological or financial or a mix of both. A large piece of the strategy to drive people into schism is to constantly bash Francis and, without actually saying it directly, maintain or suggest or hint around that he's not really the Pope. Some will say he's not the Pope because Benedict was blackmailed into resigning and therefore was still the real Pope. Benedict denied all that nonsense. Others will say, as a second option, well, Benedict did resign, but the conclave to elect Bergoglio was rigged. So while Benedict was no longer the Pope, well, Francis isn't either. And on a third option, others will take that tack and say, yeah, Benedict actually resigned, and yep, the conclave was valid, but since Francis got elected, he's become a heretic and therefore is no longer Pope. It doesn't matter which of those three roads a person travels down, they each arrive at the same destination. Today, Francis is not the Pope, which is backed up by that one podcaster's poll. Once that seed is planted, the way is paved to now say, well, then the church is no longer the church, and it really resides over here in what three popes have said is a schismatic movement. Viewers and supporters must understand how they are being played here. There's an agenda behind the narrative that Francis is not the Pope. Don't fall for it. Not a single cardinal who was in that conclave in 2013 that elected him has said the election was invalid, nor that he is no longer the Pope. Not a single one. Problems? Sure. Massive problems? A reign of confusion? Without a doubt. But Francis is the Pope, and the church is the church, and schism is never the answer to a crisis. Every heretic and every schismatic in the past 2,000 years thought they were justified and correct in their decision to either form a new church or break away and claim the crisis transferred the authority of the church to them. It did not. No matter how bad he is, Francis is the Pope. And, as he and his predecessors said, the SSPX is in schism. We just wish and pray Francis would stop giving the schismatics and their internet talking heads so much ammunition. God love you. I'm Michael Voris.